I don't think it's crazy to say that when most people think of the word communism or socialism, they think of Russia or the Soviet Union to be precise. You know, some might think of Scandinavian countries, especially since they do be having that whole democratic socialism stuff. But for many years, especially to those in the US due to McCarthyism or the witch hunts that would come for anybody who shared views seen as socialist, communist, anti-war, or really anything that was anti-American at the time, you know, those people lose their livelihoods, their jobs, and their entire reputation over simple suspicion, not even any hard facts.
America will urinate on each and every one of you. Salam alaikum.
This kind of created a sort of blind spot where words like socialism, communism, Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism, all the types of isms have been conflated to the point that they are basically kind of meaningless. And yeah, I just threw a whole bunch of words at you, but today we're going to be talking about the Russian Revolution. And to talk about that, I think it's important to understand even a simple definition of socialism and communism and show that while, yeah, they are all connected to some extent, they are separate ideas, and understanding the differences is crucial to the understanding of the Russian Revolution itself, and also just other revolutions of the time, or those that would come in places like Mexico, Cuba, Vietnam, China, and countless other places throughout the globe. It's easy to see all the chaos and destruction caused by Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism, and just blindly paint it as communism and socialism as a whole. And while in some says it is part of that, there's a lot of nuance to be had. And I personally don't hold any of these values. I do think it is important, though, to go over what these ideas were at their core to see why they were so important and influential at their time. So yeah, I just want to preface, I'm not an expert or anything. I'm literally just a dude making silly little YouTube videos. And the view I'm going to give of them is very brief. I would like to think that I have a good grasp on it, but just to add some context to the story of the revolution, it's going to be very brief. If you want a bit more in-depth descriptions, at least in a video format, I highly recommend you check out Ryan Chapman's channel. I'll definitely link it in the description. I watched some of his videos on this. They're very good in my opinion. And also read on them a bit yourself if you feel inclined. I think the more context you understand, the more history makes sense and is interesting in my opinion. It all kind of just, ties in together. Okay, so first we're going to go over socialism, since the modern idea of socialism comes before modern communism. Though there have been communal societies in the past that were usually built around religious communal living or just communal living in general, it's not the same as what we would today call communism. So yeah, socialism is an idea that does not have per se a single person that invented it, but it was a group of people. There's a lot of ideas behind socialism to tie together, but at its heart, it is the idea that the people, the workers actually, would have a fair share in society, and usually, but not always, through democratic means, they would continue to give rights to the working class until society was on an even playing field for everybody. Communism is a progression of this per se. Instead of the workers having a fair share of the control, communism aimed at getting rid of private property, and at its most final state, it aimed to be a stateless society in which there is no class struggle, since some of its heaviest proponents saw class struggle as driving human conflict as a whole. While not always associated with a revolution at its birth, which some actually trace to a man named Babouf, who would be beheaded during the time of the French Revolution under the Directory, some of its later proponents saw a revolution to be necessary to be able to institute a communist utopia. Now, one thing that we should go over that is key is that private property in this context does not specifically mean like your house or your personal belongings. It's referring to the ideas that can be traced back to John Locke centuries before, but it's not really like a direct contradiction of those. Y'all remember him? John Locke? If you're American, you definitely had to write a DBQ or something similar in the past about his ideas of life, liberty, and property, especially since Thomas Jefferson stole his whole fucking flow when it came to that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness thing. In this context, property usually refers to the means of industrial production, as John Locke believed that when a human transformed a piece of nature, he was putting his essence on it, thus making it his property in some sense. Now, communism saw industrial bosses, known as the bourgeoisie, taking over this property from the workers, known as the proletariat, as they were paid a fixed amount for their work and they had no right or say over the surplus of their labor. Communism aimed at getting rid of the system of surplus profits as a whole and give the proletariat full control of what it was to be done with the surplus, completely detached from the idea of profit and a fixed wage that they were paid, which was deemed to be exploitive, heavily in due part to, like I said, them not having any say of the benefit of the surplus, and all of that benefit was just kept away private by those with capital who owned the factories. Okay. So that is the core idea of communism and its differentiation from socialism in like a tiny little bit of a nutshell. So now let's get into Marxism. So you see this guy? This is Karl Marx, an economist and philosopher, most well known for creating the Communist Manifesto, which was sort of a rallying cry for the communists of his time, and in some sense was an outlet for him to voice his disillusion with the current capitalist system. As a philosopher, Marx is regarded as one of the last great system builders, which is basically a person that aims to be able to break down and explain the world as a whole through their theories. And Marx was a heavy proponent that the economic model of the world was what drove everything around it. And the current model was based on the exploitation of the lower class, the proletariat, by the business owners, the bourgeoisie. He also believed that history was history with like a capital H, as some might say, He saw history as something that wasn't like fully alive, but it responded to the world and its happenings as a whole, and it had the space for men to come in and have like an impact on it. But he believed that history as a whole continued forward, and he saw communism as the next step for humanity. He didn't invent communism, but like I said, he just saw it as the logical next step for people to take, as he saw the class struggle created by the current capitalist system being the driving factor for conflict in the world as a whole. He also viewed himself as a man of science and fact. Remember when I said a second ago, the communist utopia? Well, to be utopian in this time, and especially to Marx, was seen as someone that was naive, since in some sense utopians of this time sort of just hoped for better things to happen. And while Marx wrote about the revolution, he didn't give any clear direction or blueprint for it. He was more concerned in giving what he viewed as a scientifically accurate criticism of capitalism and explain why communism should be the logical next step for humans to take, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. While this wasn't part of the Communist Manifesto and not entirely coined by him, since this was like a sentiment long in the making, this exact wording was key to Marxism, as he envisioned a society that would be able to provide for everybody and would also allow for everybody to contribute. To him, this was an antithesis to the disparity that he was living next to in industrial England in the 19th century. Alright, so that is a bare bones explanation of what would turn into Marxism, as it was created by Karl Marx and his partner Friedrich Engels. He just doesn't get dragged into the ism, but then the proponents of these ideas would themselves be Marxists, and we will talk about them and the roles in the revolution in a second. But first, now that we have the ideology kind of down, we need to talk about the situation that would allow for these ideas to become appealing to the population of Russia, especially since Marx, kind of biased, as a German living in England at the time, believed that this type of revolution would take place in a nation with an already strong industrial base, as he saw this needed for the revolution, and it was a core part of his model of worker oppression. Instead, though, it would take root in the Russian Empire of the late 19th and 20th century, a place that, from his perspective, living until 1883, did not have the situation necessarily as far as the industry goes for the revolution to take place. Our story, in some sense, then, begins in 1861 with this man, Tsar Alexander II. He viewed himself as a reformer and somebody that cared for the people, so on March 3rd, 1861, he would abolish Russian serfdom through the Emancipation Manifesto, though there were some big caveats to this thing. While the serfs, who in the past were basically property of their landlords, were now free to do with their lives as they pleased, the landowners were given government bonds to make up for the free lost labor, and these bonds would be then paid through labor to their lords by the people, in many cases a period of 49 years, which when your Russian peasant had a life expectancy of about 50 years if they were able to make it into adulthood, you could see how this was a problem, as the majority of people would work until they were dead, and any remaining debt would just be passed on to their family. So for some people, the debt that they owed for their freedom was paid over a couple of generations. And while serfdom is basically already slavery with extra steps, this reform that gave the people freedom just added extra steps to their already extra steps. So this was just like slavery with extra steps. This was sort of par for the course with Tsar Alexander II. Once again, he viewed himself as a reformer in front of the people, but in reality, he was kind of just another ineffective autocrat. Alexander II would be assassinated on March 3rd, 1881 by a nationalist group called the People's Will. A few bombs would be thrown at his royal possession, and he would initially be wounded, but nothing serious. Though when he went to check on some of the people who were like not so lucky, another bomb was thrown at his feet and he was mortally wounded and would die later that day at the Winter Palace, elevating his son, Alexander III, into the throne, and that guy was a whole nother issue. Also, his grandson was there, Nicholas, and while it's not confirmed if the future Tsar was physically there at the Winter Palace at his grandfather's deathbed, as he was 12 at the time, his father definitely was, and the sight of his dying father or grandfather instilled in him a sense of divine right that the Russian Tsar was chosen by God to lead the people, and also a big disdain for the reformative ideas that his father was pushing at the time, since he blamed those pushing for the reforms for his death as well. Both of these feelings would be shared by Nicholas in the future. As Tsar, Alexander III increased his grip on the nation and made the Okhrana a major part of his government, officially called the Department for Protecting the Public Security and Order because they just love to have these super dystopian names. This institution would be used by Alexander as a secret police to crack down on the people in the aftermath of his father's death. As Alexander III became a hard man after the death of his father, he began to see his son, Nicholas II, as sort of weak, since he displayed emotions and had like interests, especially beyond military strategy and other war stuff. So basically thinking Nicholas is more interested in dilly-dallying, his father kept him away from government decisions and sort of shunned him away from learning how it was that one was supposed to be Tsar. 13 years later, not much had changed. Nicholas did get to go on this cool trip to meet Russia's neighbors, but when in Japan, his cousin, the Prince of Greece and Denmark, a guy named George, saved his life from getting his head chopped off by one of their police escorts with a katana, but he did get a big scar from it and also this cool dragon tattoo. So yeah, Japan trip, decently successful. Still though, his father neglected teaching Nicholas how it was that he was actually supposed to rule. About 3 years after Nicholas came home from this trip that was meant to help him get a grasp on the world and the way that it worked, and 13 years after the death of his grandfather, his father, Alexander III, would pass away suddenly from kidney inflammation. Although he had been sickly for months, no one could have expected him to die at this relatively young age of 49. Ironic that that's the terms imposed by his father on the Russian Serbs, but that's just me. So this would make 26-year-old Nicholas Tsar. It was after all time for him to get off his parents' insurance to get a job, So 26, 6, with minimal government experience due to both his age and his father not really believing in him, Nicholas was elevated to Emperor of Russia, the largest nation in the world and one of the biggest powers in Europe, Nepo baby at its peak. Much like his father, he believed himself, like the rest of his dynasty, as being chosen by God to rule over the people. So even though he knew he was ill prepared for this responsibility, he jumped at the opportunity, much like King Louis XVI. If you haven't watched my video on the French Revolution, you def should. I'd really appreciate it. I'll even wait here while you go watch it. I'll even put it up here in the little corner too. Thanks. But yeah, much like King Louis, he was a bit of a naive man who was really not prepared for the task at hand. And like his father, due to the assassination of his grandfather, he did not see himself as a reformer. And while repression was still big under the Okhrana, under Nicholas it seemed more of an intel assignment rather than forceful repression like his father. They spent a large portion of their resources infiltrating all types of anti-Tsarist groups, from student-led groups to even the Bolsheviks themselves. He would take a different approach to the whole thing, meaning he didn't institute any real reforms and also didn't go out his way to have the Okhrana work overtime to crush dissidents that was building due to the lack of the reform. He just sort of took it day by day, seemingly taking a bit more relaxed take on this whole emperor thing. I think his journal entries are a great window into this. For almost all historical and significant events, his journal basically just had a few sentences just describing what happened that day and just nothing more. It was kind of stoic, which in my opinion just shows that he was not ready for all these events. You know, the lights were too bright and he just wasn't ready to deal with it. So now that we have the backdrop to our story and introduce the Tsar, one of the main characters, I think we should also talk about some of the other key players on the revolutionary side. And sort of as a other aside, the Russian Revolution was many events within itself. Some of them were smaller revolutions, and the event with the biggest impact we commonly refer to as the October Revolution or the Bolshevik Revolution was kind of more like a coup. Lenin said it as much himself, but still, it was a long path to get there, and it's good to know some of the revolutionaries that would stand at the top when it was all said and done. So now, as I said, Alexander II would be assassinated by bombs, which little fun, not so fun fact, this is probably one of the earliest known suicide bombings because the person that killed him also killed himself during the assassination. But yeah, there were obviously many plots like this on his son Alexander III and his grandson Nicholas II, but none of these obviously came to fruition. But there was one specific plot that would be unraveled in 1887 as the same organization, the People's Will, who had killed Alexander II, now aimed to kill his son Alexander III, as he was, now the Tsar. This event though would be thwarted, and 5 conspirators would be sentenced to hang on May 20th, 1887. Most of them were university students between the ages of 20 and 22. Now, as part of Russian imperial law, those sentenced to death had the option to seek clemency from the Tsar himself, and some did. While only 5 of them were executed, about 15 people were implicated in the plot as a whole, some of them due to seeking clemency from the Tsar and some of them also to lower levels of involvement in the plot as a whole. The 5 young men who were hanged though did not seek clemency at all, and they saw their death as like a political statement per se. One of those executed that day was 20-year-old Alexander Yulianov, a brilliant university student who came from a family of low aristocracy and sufficient financial means. While he would not go down in history as a major player in Russian history, his 17-year-old brother, who was not there for the execution, was undoubtedly shaken by it at his family's home. His name was Vladimir Yulianov, but history would remember him as Vladimir Lenin, the man who turned the Russian Empire into the Soviet Union. Lenin, born April 22nd, 1870, came from a family of low aristocracy, and while not incredibly wealthy, they had more means than most. His mother even was able to request clemency for his brother Alex personally to Tsar Alexander, but clemency was denied, and instead his mother was allowed to visit her son one last time the day before his execution. Lenin's parents were both very educated and part of the strongest part of the middle class. His father eventually became director of schools to their province Simbirsk, which would then make them part of the service nobility under the Tsar's government. The name Lenin he would take on after his exile so that he continued to write anti-government pieces, and he would eventually create many other names to make it seem like there were multiple people with a similar point of view writing to incite these ideas in the people. Lenin was basically one of the original Reddit political bots, to be honest. This practice though of changing one's name was commonplace amongst the revolutionaries. For most names like Joseph Stalin, Leon Trotsky might ring a bell, but both men were born with different names. Stalin was born Yosef Yugashvili and Trotsky was born Lev Ronstein. Much like Lenin, their name change was due to wanting anonymity, since Russian revolutionaries in exile were one of history's most famous duos. Lenin was deeply hurt by his brother's execution because, who wouldn't be? And he would become radicalized by the situation of the people of Russia. While he himself, like I said, was not needing for much, he saw that those around him were struggling to meet their basic needs. And through learning about Marx and his views of communism, Lenin himself would become a Marxist as he laid at the foot of the government and the wealthy all the disparities that he saw in Russian life. Trotsky would be born November 19th, 1879. Him and a family member of mine actually have the same birthday, so happy Christmas to them. He would be born to a wealthy farmer father in Ukraine and an educated mother who would instill in him the power and importance of education. He would be sent to study at the port town of Odessa, a huge city when compared to his native Yanovka. He would slowly become acquainted with socialist and other populist thoughts, and while he hung around Marxist circles, he wouldn't go into it at first like Stalin or Lenin did. One of the big turning points, both in his life and ideology, was meeting his wife, Alexandra Sokolovskaya, a staunch believer believer in Marxism and a strong voice in the Marxist circles that Trotsky frequented. It was during one debate over how Marxism should be the way forward for Russian society, where Alexandra really conveyed to him through her speech and his questions why Marxism was the way to go forward. He both fell in love with Alexandra and would come around to seeing Marxism in new light. Once again, this was not the moment that he would like dive headfirst into the revolution with Lenin. That wouldn't be until much later. But from here on out, Trotsky would carefully read and ponder on Marxist thought until, just like most of his contemporaries, he saw the promise in it and believed that through it they could liberate the people of his nation. Stalin, on the other hand, did not come from a wealthy family at all. Technically, he wasn't even Russian. Trotsky himself was actually technically Ukrainian, and Stalin was born in the town of Gori in Georgia, which was part of the Russian Empire then, but it was the Caucasus regions. There is some debate to his birthday, but the date that is most commonly accepted is December 30th, 1878. So really close to the New Year. So happy birthday to him, I guess. He was the son of a cobbler who sometimes worked for the army. During his early life, his father was absent a lot due to his alcoholism and inconsistent work, meaning that his mother had to take care of Stalin and his siblings, and she would provide for them by working for the wealthier people in Gori, doing things like washing, cleaning, and also seamstress of sorts. Stalin was a brilliant young man, and he was able to use this academic talent to be given a scholarship to the seminary school in Tiflis, the capital for the region where Georgia was in the empire, and also the modern capital of the country of Georgia. Through this program, paid for by the state, Stalin was given free room and board on his way to becoming a priest. A life that, while inconspicuous and not really having any glitz and glamour to it, will certify his position in society and will give him more than comfortable living standard when compared to his life in the past. He would, though, in his last year, basically drop out and give up this small of life privilege to fight for the revolution as he became involved with Lenin and other prominent revolutionaries. For almost 2 decades, he would have no real employment, really no real life, as he was constantly either in hiding or in exile. Alright, so these are some of the key figures. There are obviously more big Bolsheviks and other Marxist leaders during this time, but these 3 men would play some of the biggest roles once the Tsarist government was fully taken out, because in some sense they didn't create the revolution at all. If anything, they just took advantage of many events, some of them revolutions in themselves, and it's now time to get back to those events. Alright, so we left off at around 1896 when Nicholas was coronated after his father's death. So yeah, Nicholas was just not up for this shit, and it was evident to a lot of people from day one. On the day of his coronation, a celebration was to be held where people were going to be given free beer, food, and even like little commemorative gifts. This though would turn into a deadly stampede where more than 1,000 people were killed. Worst of all, Nicholas, even though fully aware of the tragedy, still attended a ball later that night, which the people also knew about, and this stained his reputation from day one, since they called him Nicholas the Bloody, as he was more interested in partying than mourning the people of his nation. This would also add to the views of him being ill-prepared to be the emperor, which even he said he was. Another big piece to how he was perceived was the Russo-Japanese War. You see, this event would take place in 1904 and was in some sense used by the Tsarist government to increase morale within the nation, because nothing gets the people happy like winning a war, but also to expand the empire and acquire new resources, since most of the fighting was over control of areas like modern-day Korea and Manchuria. But to be honest, to them, what's some dead Russians when the Japanese were seen as a joke when compared to the might of a military European nation like Russia? This would basically be like stealing oil and resources from a little kid. But when the war ended on September 5th, 1905, with Japan standing over Russia, the rest of the world basically just yelled, "Water!" The food revolts and general public unrest that had predated the war was now on even bigger display, and this would be one of the triggers for the first of the revolutions that were to come, the 1905 revolution. Another trigger for this first revolution would be the events of January 22nd, 1905. Thousands of workers from St. Petersburg, led by a priest named Georgy Gapon, would peacefully march to the Winter Palace and ask for, the typical shit starving overworked people ask for: better pay, better working conditions and hours, and more food. And also to end the war with Japan, because even at this point, nobody wanted to keep fighting some imperialist war for a government that didn't even provide them with the bare minimum. Now, Nicholas, he wasn't even home. He had actually left the day before, as those close to him feared unrest and sort of saw the protests coming before they happened. So now, Nicholas, he's not home, but the people are still there protesting. And even though, once again, this is a peaceful protest with people not holding any type of weapons, but literal religious icons and pictures of the Tsar and his family, for some reason, the royal guards shoot into the crowd, killing hundreds. This event became known as Bloody Sunday. Father Gapon would survive, and his words in the aftermath really encapsulate how the nation felt at this moment. There is no God anymore. There is no Tsar. Several months of civil unrest and other massive strikes would continue to tear through the country, as it was clear to people that the Tsar not only didn't have the best intentions in mind, his power and legitimacy were now beginning to crumble, as so did the financial situation of his empire. The 1905 revolution of October 30th was not a revolution done by force, but rather the result of the people's constant and incessant demands for their leader to listen to them. Violence did occur post Bloody Sunday, but the situation that the empire was in at this moment had been boiling over for many years at this point. The 1905 revolution instead was the Tsar basically seeing the empire crumbling around him and going like, okay, fine, I'll give you guys civil liberties such as freedom of speech, assembly, and press. And also he would institute a government body known as the Duma, through which laws would be passed. It was kind of like a parliament of sorts, and this was the first of its kind in Russian history, so that was definitely a step towards the right direction. The next decade or so was a slog politically and just like in every sense. The Duma was ineffective since a few months after the October 1905 revolution, Nicholas would issue the fundamental laws of 1906 in May of, you wouldn't have guessed it, 1906. In this, he would reiterate his absolute power over his empire and basically take back the promise for the Duma of having any real authority. He withheld final veto power and also had the power to dissolve the session whenever he wanted. He would also be the one appointing the ministers that would actually be at the head of the institutions, and he personally kept control of the military and foreign affairs, and whoever controls the army most of the time controls the nation. So time and time again, anytime any real change was starting to brew, it was squashed by Nicholas, thus creating an incredibly ineffective government that instituted reforms that didn't really do much for the people of Russia. While not much seemed to be happening in Russia, the rest of Europe was going through a lot, to say the least. There was just a lot of pent-up sexual tension between all the countries and wanting to beat each other up with all these new weapons that they had created. And it all really get going in the summer of 1914, when Gavrilo Princip, a literal teenager, would assassinate the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife Sophie in Sarajevo. This would finally let the European powers have their literal release. So slowly at first, but eventually all together, almost all European powers were dragged into what would become the bloodiest conflict in history yet, World War I, Russia included. During this time, the Tsar in control of the military left the capital, renamed to Petrograd since they were fighting the Germans, and St. Petersburg just sounded a little bit too German. So back at home, his German wife, Tsarina Alexandra, would sort of be keeping a look over the government, but in general, it was a lot of turmoil back there. As while war at first ignited a bit of nationalism in the people, they kind of remember they're basically starving peasants who are now being sent off to die by the thousands for something that literally has nothing to do with them. So riots and public unrest skyrocketed throughout the early years of the war. This caused an economic breakdown. Shocker. This would then be coupled with huge scandals coming from the high aristocracy, mainly Rasputin. He was a cosplay monk, priest, and doctor who was actually none of those things and was more than anything a sexual deviant who loved to party. And he was also really close to the royal family since he was able to help the heir Alexei with his bouts of hemophilia or the incapacity for blood to clot. He was officially the boy's spiritual healer, but for some people they viewed him as a sign of how weird and disconnected the government was with its people. And also many rumors reported that he was the one actually running the country behind the scenes through this arena, as they also thought they were fucking. But that's kind of none of my business. It would though be the business of some other aristocrats, as they saw Rasputin as a big factor to the continued unrest within the public. So in late December 1916, the Tsar's cousin, nephew-in-law, and some other politicians would kill Rasputin. Rasputin's death though, it didn't change much, and as 1916 turned into 1917, shit still sucked for the people of Russia, and they were continuing to demand change. And over the last few years, many a massacre had happened during a riot, notably the Lena Goldfields massacre of 1912, where miners in Siberia revolted when they were literally fed rancid horse dick as rations. This revolt went in armed forces firing on them and killing about 200 miners. Shooting on protesters and general executions of dissidents was incredibly commonplace, and thousands would be executed. So much so that the news was named Stolypin's necktie, after Pyotr Stolypin, the man in charge of this crackdown. But in some sense, the troops who were doing the killing themselves were also at the end of the day people. And more than that, they are much closer to one of the regular people that they are killing, much closer than to the aristocrats that are ordering them to kill their fellow Russians. So while they wouldn't say it, they knew this was fucked up. And very soon, this distaste within the army would be a huge factor in the downfall of the Russian government. The event that would topple the Russian Tsar would be the February Revolution, which is actually kind of a misnomer since it actually happened in March, but Imperial Russia used the Julian calendar, which is about 13 days behind the Gregorian calendar, which is the one that we use. The first event that is attributed to be part of the February Revolution would happen on March 8th, 1917, International Women's Day. Woo! On this day, like many others, people would take to the streets of Petrograd, this time mostly women at the start. International Women's Day makes sense. But soon enough, workers and other people of the city were coming together to protest, and a few days later, by the 11th, hundreds of thousands of people were outside demanding change and better conditions. The same day, the Tsar would order the troops to do something and tell these people to chill the fuck out. But on the 12th, instead of listening to Dear Leader, the troops had enough, and entire regiments even joined the protesters. Seeing this, the Duma would instate a provisional committee to try and deal with all of this, but this would do little, as over the next few days, the government would entirely collapse as the people seeked real change, and none of this Disney bullshit that the Tsar had been selling them for over a decade now was working. On the 14th of March, the workers and protesters would institute the Petrograd Soviet, a group created by the people which aimed to be the government that would actually represent them, the people. Seeing all of this go down, and also realizing that the war was still going on, the military officers and other politicians would beg and eventually convince Nicholas to abdicate the throne on March 15th and make his son Alexei the emperor, hoping that the nation would rally around a literal kid for some reason. He's a cute kid, but I don't know, whatever. At the last second though, since his abdication would mean that he would have to leave his family and live outside of Russia, separated from his sickly son, Nicholas instead abdicated to his brother. But basically, dude saw this whole little clusterfuck and said,
"Wouldn't let that shit happen to me though."
and he refused the throne. And just like that, 300 years of Romanov rule didn't crash and burn. It simply fizzled since there was no next in line. So now, with no emperor, there wasn't really a clear line for who's next in power. And the following months would see various factions such as the Duma, the provisional government, and all those dudes that we talked about at the start, battling it out for the top spot in the Russian government. You might have noticed I didn't mention Trotsky, Stalin, or Lenin during any of this. And that's because they had nothing to do with any of this directly. Like I said, they were literally all in exile or hiding during all of this, watching from afar as the revolution came and went, and they weren't there for it. But by April, Lenin, with the help of the Germans, would find himself back in Russia. And this is where the figures we talked about will mark their place in history, as over the next few months, the situation really didn't improve for the people of Russia, and behind the scenes, the Bolsheviks under Lenin were preparing to coup the government. It would be one of the most significant moments of the 20th century, the October Revolution of 1917, which would see Lenin and his buddies take the ashes of the Russian Empire and turn them into the Soviet Union with the promise of a communist Marxist society. But you know what? Not spoil the whole thing or anything like that, but as we're going to see in the next episode, these people were not going to get what they bargained for out of Lenin and his friends. And if anything, the person that's left standing at the end is probably the worst person that they could have had. So, yeah, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next time. Thank you.